Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and we have a fun one today. It's a double poison pawn in the French defense. So the French starts out with e4, e6, something I never like to see if I'm playing e4. So this is the French, typically continues with d4 and then d5. Knight to c3, pretty common from white. Bishop to b4. This is the Winnower variation. I think it's pretty common for black. I do have a separate video if you want to check out the Winnower if you're just interested in different variations in the French defense. But after bishop here to b4, then the main line is pawn to e5. Black decides to respond with c5. Typically in the French defense, you're going to see white attacking and expanding on the king side of the board. Black's looking to do the same thing on the queen side. So c5 does exactly that, opens up the queen side, starts to chip away at the center pawn here on d4. And white has really two main options here. Knight to f3 is the main one, but I think another tricky option that sometimes white will try is queen here to g4. And you can see queen here on g4 is not only defending this pawn here on d4, it's also attacking the pawn here on g7. Now, this is a poison pawn, and we'll actually look at what happens if they take that, because black can give up another pawn. It's a poison pawn. And this trap is actually something that the best players in the world have fallen into. So 10 years ago, Magnus Carlsen, playing the white pieces, fell into this trap. And you may say, 10 years ago, was Magnus Carlsen that good? Yes, Magnus Carlsen became the #1 player in the world in 2011. So 10 years ago, he was winning literally every tournament he was playing. He fell for this trap and ended up losing. So it is a good one. And hopefully after this video, you will think so as well. Black is going to continue with knight to e7, and this is really laying the trap, so you're not going to just play something like pawn to g6 that may look like it's stopping the queen coming down here to g7, which it is, but it's not really setting a trap. So knight to e7 makes it look like, okay, yes, you almost have to move the knight or the pawn, because if not, then the queen could just come down here on g7 and then easily take the rook. So it almost looks like the knight's just moving out of the way so that the rook is not going to be taken very easily and potentially just doesn't want to play g6. So white many times will just go ahead and take that pawn here on g7. Black's going to play rook to g8. The rook's under attack, so pretty much has to move, but now white can just easily take this pawn here on h7. And this is the trap, because if white takes these two pawns, yes, black cannot castle on the king side anymore. That's completely okay. Black is going to have a very good game here because they have a lot of threats. And the first threat is the pawn taking here on d4. This knight here on c3 is being pinned to the king by the bishop here on b4. So that is the first threat here, that white can just lose the knight here on c3 with the pawn taking here. So how does white really respond to this? Well, if you look at something like pawn to a3, this attacks the bishop. Well, okay, this gets tricky because the move queen to a5. And this just says, yeah, if you want to take my bishop, that's fine, because now we can just come down here and take with our queen here on a1. And now we're also threatening the move queen takes here on c1. They can't move their bishop because it's being pinned down by the queen. So really, they need to move the knight to e2 for two reasons. One, it's defending this bishop here on c1, but also it's being attacked by this pawn here on d4. So if you look at this setup, all of a sudden, white lost the rook here on a1, not exactly what they want to. Their knight on e2 is kind of stuck because it's defending the bishop. The bishop can't move. It's pinned down. Because this knight's here, this light square bishop on f1 is not going anywhere. The knight on g1 definitely can get out, so that's a move that white has here. And black's pretty well defended. The queen over here on h7 is kind of hanging out by themselves, and so black can really do exactly what they want. They can get their other pieces involved into the game. Knight to b6 if they want, or c6 if they want to. That's going to attack both the pawn here on e5 as well as the pawn here on b4. They can get their bishop involved into the game. So they can start to push up the other pawns here on the b file and the a file. So black has a lot of threats here, and it's going to be very difficult for black to continue. If we come back, maybe they decide, okay, probably not the best idea to just take right there. So let's get the rook out of harm's way. Let's go ahead and play rook to b1. Okay, well, in this case, we go ahead and take the knight here on c3, as we talked about. They take our bishop, but then we can play queen to a2. Now, this is still threatening the rook, and the rook is going to fall. Anytime they take and they leave open this a file, we're just going to come down and eventually take their rook here. So now they could play rook to e2. We're going to take their rook here on b1. Pawn takes here on c3. That's completely fine. And then we can play something like knight to d7. Different ways of how you want to get the knight involved into the game, but this threatens this pawn here on e5. It also allows, if we wanted to get the knight to come back here to f8 and have some protection in there as well. So a couple options from white there, but you can see black even has more material here because we're able not only to take that knight, but we're also able to take that rook. Okay, so let's come back. We've already looked at the fact that if they don't play pawn to a3, then we're pretty much just going to take with our pawn here on c3. They're going to lose the knight. That's going to be pretty difficult. And so a3 makes some sense to attack the bishop here. But then we have the threat of queen to a5, and they can't really take with their pawn here because then we're just going to take their rook. So what if they decide to just leave that alone and start to develop material on the king side of the board, recognizing they really have to get material out, start to attack black at some capacity, or else they're just going to get suffocated and lose. So maybe knight to f3. Black's always going to take that knight here on c3 with the pawn. Pawn to b3, I think, is the best move from white. If you look at the threats that black has after the pawn takes here, it's a discovered attack. The bishop is now going to check the king, and then white's going to lose either the bishop or the rook. So I really think that white almost has to play b3. If not, they're definitely going to lose material here. Then black plays knight to d7 because white does have the threat now of bishop here to d3. Preparing to come over and attack here on the king side of the board. Also, they need to be opening up to castle on the king side to get some sort of safety here. But now we can just come down, take the pawn here on g2. That's one thing to keep in mind. As soon as they play bishop here to d3, we're just eyeing down and we can just take this material here on g2. They could play knight to g5, threatening something like queen takes here on f7. That would be very bad for black. We can just go ahead and take the rook. Yes, we gave up a rook for a knight and a pawn, but that's going to be completely okay as far as the situation that we have to worry about here. So after the bishop takes, we can now play knight to c6. This is attacking this pawn right here. We still have a lot of threats. They still can't take with their pawn right here because we could just take their rook up here. And they're going to have a difficult time. Now, you do have to be very cautious from black's standpoint because you have a weakened king. There's not a lot of protection here. The knight here on d7 is going to do a good job of coming down here to f8 if it needs to protect from the queen at some point. But this is going to be very dynamic from both sides. And you can see that at any given move, either side can fall apart. But I do think black has a good position in this setup. So that is the double poison pawn trap. So if we come back, it's really not the best move for white to go ahead and take this pawn here on g7. And if they do take, rook comes over here to g8. I think it gets even trickier if they decide to take this pawn here on h7. They could just come back to h6. The main reason that queen to h6 is better is, let's just continue down the same lines we were looking at. Pawn takes here on d4. This knight's being pinned down, so play a3 as we talked about. Queen to a5, but now they can take, and after we take the rook here on a1, now you can see that this queen is protecting the bishop. Now before, they pretty much had to play knight to e2 because that was not only the knight's being under attack, so it has to move. And if they move anywhere else, the bishop's not defended, so the queen can just come here to c1. It's going to fall. There's nowhere else because it's being pinned. But because the queen is actually protecting, it's on these dark squares, then the knight is free to actually go somewhere else. So the knight can come here to b5. It's attacking the pawn here on d4. It's also no longer blocking off this light square bishop. So it's going to be much better for white. If they don't actually fall for the double poison pawn trap, just go ahead and take that one poison pawn. I still think they're going to be in a tough spot. You can see the queen's not going anywhere. It's very easy for black to get their own knight involved into the game. Put a lot of pressure on the opponent, even just pushing forward with both the pawns. Yes, you do lose your central pawn here, but as soon as this light square bishop moves, black can come up, take this material here on g2. So a lot of stuff that white has to deal with, but I think it's a much better position if they play queen here to h6 than taking the extra pawn here on h7. So that is the double poison pawn trap. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully, if you like playing the French, you can lay this trap for someone and they can fall in it. If you are playing as white and you run up against this, hopefully now you know how to avoid the worst lines possible. So thank you guys so much for watching the video. I'll see you guys in the next one.